The lights in the studio were too perfect, clean, clinical, engineered to flatter and strip all shadows. Jasmine Crockett sat beneath them, hands folded lightly on the polished desk, as though resting in prayer. The navy blue suit she wore wasn't chosen for elegance, it was armor. Minimalist lines, no frill, just authority wrapped in restraint. Her eyes were lined not with makeup, but with intention. Across from her sat Andrew Bondi. The man had made a second career out of sounding righteous, while protecting everything rotten in the structure. He was a darling of cable news, a former prosecutor with a talent for performative outrage, always one smirk away from calling his opponent naive or uninformed. Tonight was no different. The grin he wore wasn't just for the camera, it was for her, Congresswoman Crockett, he said, leaning in with that familiar rehearsed sincerity. I think the American people deserve more than moral theatrics when it comes to legislation. Wouldn't you agree? The moderator chuckled, clearly ready for another round of predictable jabs. But Jasmine didn't answer right away. Her eyes, sharp and focused, didn't move from Bondi. She blinked slowly. I agree, she said, voice measured, not a trace of defensiveness. Theatrics are a waste of time, especially when lives are at stake. Bondi smiled wider, as if he'd won. Something already. The nation watched. Some from the comfort of their couches, others from break rooms, bars, classrooms. Phones in hand, eyes locked in, waiting for fireworks, waiting for the next viral exchange. But Jasmine wasn't playing for views. She was here for the reckoning. The segment had started like any other. Budget appropriations. Healthcare oversight, the language of ethics sterilized by legalese. But somewhere beneath the surface of her calm, something darker was gathering. She was biding time. Not out of hesitation, but calculation. Because when you confront power, you don't swing wildly. You wait for its mask to slip. As Bondi launched into a story about bipartisan integrity, Jasmine's mind drifted not away, but deeper. To the folder that arrived on her desk 48 hours ago, anonymous, unsigned, containing a single paperclip binding dozens of pages. Legal contracts, transaction records, meetings all tied to Bondi, pharmaceutical lobbyists, quiet edits made to legislation, payments routed through shell firms in exchange for silence. She hadn't told her staff everything yet. Only her closest aide, who had stared at the first few pages with widened eyes. If this leaks and it's false, it's not false, Jasmine had said. I just haven't proven it. Yet. Back in the studio, Bondi was mid-sentence, delivering a monologue dressed as a question. Because the real issue is transparency. We need leaders who don't just shout about corruption, but understand how to legislate against it. And there it was, the opening. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, just enough to shift the weight of the moment. Transparency? She echoed, her voice deceptively light. I'm so glad you brought that up, Mr. Bondi. He looked at her, curious, still smug, because tonight, she said, I'd like to discuss what transparency really looks like, especially when the cameras are off. Bondi chuckled again. The audience titters echoing faintly, but she didn't smile. She didn't blink. And suddenly, across every newsroom, phone screen, and courtroom that had ever underestimated a quiet woman holding truth like a blade, something changed. Jasmine wasn't here to debate. She was here to indict, and Bondi, the smiling assassin of progressive policy, had just stepped into her courtroom. 40-8 hours earlier. The Capitol was quieter than usual, thick with the kind of silence that only precedes storms. Jasmine sat alone in her office, lights low as the city hummed outside. Her staff had gone home hours ago, but she remained arms crossed, eyes locked on the manila folder spread open across her mahogany desk. The pages inside weren't speculation. They were surgical, legal documents, contract drafts, and redlined legislation. Each page traced a trail, from Bondi's days as a federal prosecutor, to his private consulting firm, to recent edits made on a pharmaceutical regulatory bill. The ink had barely dried before the bill passed with quiet bipartisan approval. Now millions stood to lose protections. And Bondi had smiled through it all. Cloaked in his polished moral outrage, Jasmine tapped a pen against her teeth, thinking, the Folder had appeared without warning, slid beneath her door like a whispered dare. No name, no return address. Just a note clipped to the front in careful block handwriting. They think no one is watching. Make them wrong, her instinct told her it wasn't fake. The language, the formatting too precise, too real. Her legal? Background screamed that this was no amateur leak. Someone with access had taken a risk? Someone trusted her enough to make her the delivery system, but trust came with burden. She had seen careers collapse over less. One wrong word, one document taken out of context, and the media machine would do the rest. She knew what they called. Women like her when they rose too fast or spoke too plainly, divisive, hysterical, unprofessional. And when a woman of color exposed power, the backlash wasn't just political, it was personal, cultural, weaponized. Still, she'd made her choice long ago. When her father died from untreated cardiac complications that would have been preventable had his insurance not been gutted by policy loopholes, Jasmine realized that law and justice were not synonyms, not in America. One could exist without the other. But not in her hands. She closed the folder gently and turned to the TV. Muted, where Bondi's face filled the screen mid-smirk, mid-interview, mid-spin. He spoke about the need for personal responsibility in public office, as if irony had taken a vacation. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. You have no idea what's coming, she murmured. Her phone buzzed. Her aide, Micah, texting. You still thinking about going live with this? She typed back. No, I'm thinking about going surgical. She picked up the folder, slipped it into a black leather portfolio, and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. Not as a politician, not as a headline, but as a prosecutor of truth. The next time Bondi smiled on TV, he wouldn't know it, but he'd be walking into a trap built by law, grief and memory. And when it snapped shut, the whole country would be watching. The studio smelled of hairspray, cold coffee, and ego. Bondi arrived 10 minutes late, as always, adjusting his tailored charcoal blazer like it was a crown. The crew didn't mind. They never did. He was a ratings magnet. The kind of man who could peddle half-truths with such charm that fact-checkers threw their hands up halfway through. He shook hands, winked at the producers, and leaned toward the makeup artist with that curated chuckle. Let's make me look honest. Jasmine had already been seated for 6 minutes, mic clipped, face unreadable. She didn't flinch when he entered. She didn't nod or smile or offer the fake civility that passed for manners in these circles. Instead, she glanced at the monitor displaying their side-by-side angles, making sure the lighting was neutral, and her posture said one thing. Control. The moderator, Greg Talton, offered a warm handshake to both, then sat between them like a man trying to host a knife fight with cocktail etiquette. We're live in 3. A voice called from behind the camera. Bondi grinned at Jasmine. Let's try not to get too emotional tonight, Congresswoman. She turned to him slowly. Let's try not to lie. Greg laughed nervously. Okay, kids, he muttered, half joking. Let's keep it spicy, not suicidal. The red light blinked on. Good evening, America, Greg began. Tonight on the Civic Pulse, we welcome Congressman Andrew Bondi and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, two powerful voices at the center of an increasingly divided debate on legislative ethics. Corporate influence and transparency, Bondi leaned in. Greg, thanks for having us. I think Americans are desperate for less noise and more clarity. He barely finished before Jasmine cut in gently, but deliberately. Clarity begins with honesty, and honesty begins with accountability. There was no heat in her tone. Just steel. Bondi smiled again. That smug, curated smirk designed to disarm audiences before dismantling arguments. He'd used it on professors, on juries, on victims who dared to raise their voices. Tonight would be no different, he thought. He turned to her, voice polished with faux humility. I appreciate the sentiment, Congresswoman, but I think voters are tired of moral posturing. They want results, not lectures. Agreed, Jasmine replied smoothly. Let's give them both. Greg sensed the current rising and steered the conversation toward a safe harbor legislative gridlock, upcoming votes, procedural logjams. Bondi took every opportunity to speak at length, name-dropping sponsors, filibusters, and fiscal responsibility. He was performing. And he assumed Jasmine was listening just to respond, but she WSN single quotes dotting him each inflection. Each deflection, the rhythm of his voice. She had heard it before in courtrooms, in press briefings, in strategy rooms where truth was buried beneath legal strategy. Bondi wasn't just a man. He was a method, a formula, a shield wrapped in credentials. And charm. He didn't see the folder tucked beneath her portfolio. He didn't notice her glancing at the red dot on the camera, gauging how many millions were watching in real time. He thought this was just another round, but Jasmine was counting down. She watched the producers exchange glances. The sound engineer shifted in his seat. Greg's pen tapped a little faster. Everyone could feel that something was coming. Bondi misread it, of course. He thought it was fear, hesitation. He leaned back in his chair, beaming. I just think the American people deserve better than grandstanding and thinly veiled attacks. That was his third condescending jab of the night. A pattern. Jasmine gave him a look that could have. Frozen glass. Then she turned back to the camera, folded her hands, and said, Then let's talk about veils. Shall we? And for the first time, Bondi blinked. The crowd watching at home couldn't tell just yet. But the trap had been triggered, and Bondi had just stepped into the first hinge of the cage. The conversation pivoted as smoothly as the control room had scripted it. Greg Talton's voice lowered as if inviting the audience into a sacred space. Let's talk about government transparency. How do we hold our institutions accountable without undermining public trust? Bondi jumped in, his tone velvety, confident. Transparency is vital, Greg, but it has to be responsible. You can't just throw around accusations without context. That's how you create chaos, not reform. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She simply turned to Greg and lifted a hand, calm and composed. Would it be all right if I had a minute of uninterrupted time? Greg, caught off guard, nodded. Of course, Congresswoman. She leaned slightly toward the mic, her voice quiet but unmistakably clear. There's a law most Americans have never heard of, she began. The Foreign Influence Disclosure Reform Act, Section 213B. It requires any former federal employee like prosecutors, for example, who enter private consulting or lobbying to disclose potential conflicts of interest when testifying before Congress or providing commentary on active legislation. Bondi shifted in his chair. Jasmine continued. What most people don't realize is that this applies even when you're not officially on a firm's payroll. If you receive compensation through intermediaries like contract consultants or third-party payments. She reached slowly into her folder. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the spotlight adjusted. Greg looked toward the control booth, uncertain if this was planned. Jasmine laid a document gently on the table between her. And Bondi, Mr. Bondi, she said, would you recognize your own signature? Bondi's expression didn't change at first. Then a brief flicker, barely a second, but it was there. A tiny crack in the porcelain confidence. The camera zoomed in. The document bore the seal of a lobbying firm, Rhodes and Barron beneath. That, a signature, his, dated 2 months before he appeared on television to advocate for a regulatory rollback in favor of a pharmaceutical giant. The same firm listed as a beneficiary in the contract. The silence in the room thickened. I've reviewed the full disclosure file, Jasmine said, voice like a scalpel. You failed to register this engagement with the Congressional Office of Ethics. In fact, you told the Ethics Oversight Subcommittee you had no ongoing financial relationships with lobbying entities. Bondi opened his mouth, but Jasmine raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough. You'll have your time. I just want to finish the record. The control room didn't cut away. They didn't dare that she tapped the document. You didn't just withhold. You knowingly misled Congress and the American public while posing as an impartial legal analyst. Bondi tried to summon that familiar smirk, but it faltered. There was something different in Jasmine's tone tonight, something surgical, unyielding. Greg glanced nervously at the producer. The crew wasn't breathing. Jasmine folded her hands again. Transparency, you said, she repeated softly. Then let's be transparent. Mr. Bondi, about whose interests you're really representing when you sit in that chair and pretend to speak for the people. And in that moment, before Bondi could spin, before the moderator could redirect, before the network could hit commercial, the room was silent, except for the sound of truth making itself heard, asterisk across the country. Timelines ignited like dry brush to flame. Clips of Jasmine's calm accusation began spreading before the commercial. Break could even be cued. A 7-second cut, her placing the document between them and saying, "Would you recognize your own signature?" was already looped on Twitter, stitched on TikTok, clipped on YouTube Shorts. The views climbed by the tens of thousands per minute. But inside the studio, no one was checking their phones because what was happening now wasn't viral content. It was a live reckoning. Bondi sat stiffly, blinking as if his eyes were struggling to catch up with reality. He tilted his head toward Greg, clearly expecting the moderator to intervene, to reset the segment, to save him, but Greg didn't. He looked down at the paper with practiced neutrality, the kind moderators used when they realized neutrality was about to drown in history. Bondi cleared his throat. "With all due respect," he began, "what the Congresswoman is suggesting," Jasmine cut in, polite but unsparing, "is documented, not suggested." He lifted a hand. "These are cherry-picked pages. Taken out of context, I'm sure. Would you like to read them on air?" Jasmine asked. "We can go page by page, line by line, clause by clause." "I have the full file." The studio tensed. You could hear the static of a coiled wire beneath Bondi's skin. He tried to smile again, but it landed wrong, strained, like a mask cracking at the edges. Greg leaned forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, to be clear, are you alleging that Mr. Bondi knowingly violated federal disclosure laws while offering public commentary on legislation he was covertly influencing?" "I'm not alleging," Jasmine said. "I'm reading the record. If Mr. Bondi wants to dispute its contents, I invite him to do so under oath." It was then that the phones in the control room began to ring. Producers picked up, faces tight. Bondi's PR team, his legal counsel, network sponsors. Someone even dialed Greg's personal line mid-segment. A wave of panic, just out of frame. Bondi tried to regain ground. "This is a political hit job?" A desperate attempt to deflect from the Congresswoman's own legislative failures. "You authored 3 amendments to the deregulation bill that directly benefited Rhodes and Bear's portfolio," Jasmine said, her voice rising just slightly. "2 of them stripped patient protections. The 3rd exempted one of your client's subsidiaries from liability lawsuits. Those are facts, not politics. Facts can be manipulated." She stared at him, razor sharp. "And you would know." There it was. The pulse, the power shift. No longer a debate. No longer 2 colleagues sparring for airtime. This was a prosecution. And the nation had become the jury. The studio remained deadly quiet except for the low murmur of producers scrambling. In the background, unsure whether to intervene or let history run its course, Greg glanced at Jasmine, then at Bondi, and back to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly, "we may be witnessing something unprecedented tonight." And somewhere behind the glass, a voice whispered what the audience already knew. This wasn't politics anymore. This was consequences, asterisk. Bondi straightened his posture like a man trying to reclaim height he no longer possessed. His voice dropped into that prosecutor's cadence, measured, deliberate, tinged with indignation. "I've spent 2 decades defending this country's legal principles in courtrooms across the nation. I will not be smeared on live television by a representative who doesn't understand the complexities of federal disclosure law." Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She leaned back slightly, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, as if giving him space to unravel. Bondi continued, emboldened by the echo of his own voice. "I won cases that reshaped entire circuits. I've taught ethics at Georgetown. And now, because of some loosely sourced paperwork, I'm being tried in the court of public opinion." He turned to Greg, expectant. "Is this what journalism has become?" Jasmine's voice cut through the air like a thread pulled tight. "Objection. Mr. Bondi," she said, "this isn't your courtroom anymore." The room froze. Even Greg, trained to moderate chaos, didn't speak. It was the kind of line that turned into a headline before the show even ended. Bondi scoffed. attempting another pivot. This is the exact kind of sensationalism that distracts the American people from real issues. Jasmine turned her gaze on him, clear, unflinching, unbothered. You used to silence witnesses, she said evenly. Now you're interrupting testimony. A beat passed, Bondi faltered. His mouth opened, but no words came. Jasmine leaned forward now, calm as ever. I'm not accusing you of being a bad liar, Mr. Bondi. I'm accusing you of being a very good one for the wrong clients. A ripple passed through the crew. Greg stared at the desk. The sound technician stopped adjusting his levels. The cameras, robotic as they were, seemed to lean in. Bondi opened his mouth again, but Jasmine was already speaking, firm, deliberate, cold as a verdict. You violated the trust of the public when you took their airwaves and turned them into a billboard for corporate immunity. You stood on national television and defended a bill that stripped away liability clauses without disclosing that the same firm who paid you to advise on that bill stood to profit by the millions. He tried again, his voice brittle now. I never lobbied. I offered legal consulting. You parsed language, Andrew, she said. You made your living on loopholes. And now you've crawled into one and can't find your way out. There it was again, that silence, the kind that follows truth when it arrives without apology. Bondi looked to Greg, to the crew, to the blinking camera light. He expected anyone to pull the brake, to interrupt, to rescue. No one did. Because the audience was no longer behind the cameras. It was the millions watching, wide-eyed, fingers hovering above the share button. Watching a man built by systems of power meet the one woman who'd learned how to disassemble those systems. One clause at a time. You can't cross-examine your way out of the truth, Jasmine said, voice low, and that sentence heavy, final, irreducible, hung in the air like the last breath of a collapsed empire. The silence didn't end with Jasmine's last words. It deepened. Settled. Greg finally cleared his throat. His voice quieter now, like even he knew the gravity had shifted. Mr. Bondi, would you like to respond? Bondi looked smaller now. Not physically, he still sat upright in his tailored suit, but something beneath the surface had cracked. His eyes darted, no longer with control but calculation. He was scanning for a foothold, a misstep, an escape route. Instead, he offered a shaky smile. I didn't come here to be put on trial. Jasmine tilted her head. Then you should have stayed off the stand. The audience watching from home couldn't see it, but the tension in the studio could be felt through every fiber optic cable. Emails stopped mid-draft. Coffee mugs hovered halfway to mouths. The nation wasn't watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. Greg shifted in his chair. Let's keep this civil. Jasmine raised a hand gently, not to interrupt, but to focus the lens. I'm civil, she said. I just don't believe in polite corruption. Bondi scoffed, reaching for his talking points like a drowning man grasping reeds. You know what this is? He said, voice rising. This is a takedown. You people love a spectacle. You don't care about policy. You care about making someone bleed on camera so you can trend for 12 hours. Jasmine didn't flinch, then let the record show. She said calmly, that I did not bring your sins into this room. You did. I simply refused to close the door behind them. Greg's eyes flicked between them, sensing the moment teetering between control and collapse. But the viewers didn't want control. They wanted truth. Bondi's defenses were collapsing in real time, and Jasmine? She didn't raise her voice once. She let her facts be the thunder. Her poise, the lightning. You were once a symbol of jurisprudence, she continued. Now you're a case study in what happens when the law forgets its own conscience. Bondi stood abruptly, mic peaking with the movement. I'm done here. Jasmine stayed seated, composed, a storm that had already passed but left the sky permanently altered. Greg tried to salvage something. We're not finished. There's still time to clarify. But Bondi was already walking off camera, muttering something about defamation and lawyers and how none of this would hold up. He was right. This wasn't a court of law. It was the court of consequence, and it had already delivered its verdict. The next morning, the courtroom wasn't the only place on fire. The entire country was No one knew who had clipped Jasmine's closing words from the night before and posted it to X, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts, just 8 seconds long. Her voice calm, eyes locked on Bondi, words like a scalpel. I didn't bring your sins into this room. You did. I simply refused to close the door behind them. 12 million views by breakfast. 20-2 by noon. By dinner time. Every network not bought by corporate interests was looping the same footage, the same stunned expression on Bondi's face as he walked off the set in real-time. Shame. Cable anchors called it the moment. Media influencers called it the strike. But the people called it justice. Inside Capitol offices, aides refreshed Twitter feeds while political consultants typed furious emails with subject lines like crisis, Crockett trend, and Bondi damage control urgent. Calls poured in from donors and party loyalists, demanding an explanation. But the real explosion came from the grassroots. Teachers in Milwaukee used Jasmine's clip to start a discussion about truth in law. A youth activist in Georgia remixed it with audio from Malcolm X veterans, posted side-by-side footage of Bondi's past policy positions and Jasmine's rebuttals. And one civil rights lawyer in Baton Rouge simply wrote, "She didn't just clap back, she filed a motion in the soul of America." Bondi tried to fight back. He went on a rival network that night, framed by soft lighting and a sympathetic anchor. He called Jasmine's performance a political ambush, accused her of distorting facts, and claimed he walked away out of respect for decorum. But the problem wasn't what he said. It was that no one was listening anymore. Because Jasmine hadn't just gone viral. She had gone vital. Back in her office, Jasmine sat with her chief of staff, Maya, as notifications poured in like hail. Endorsements, interview requests, threats, praise, hatred, donations, lawsuits. All of it. You broke the machine. Maya said softly. No, Jasmine replied. I just showed people where the gears were rusted. She looked out the window at the city below. I think now they want to see it taken apart. Maya stared at her. What do we do next? Jasmine didn't blink. We keep going. This wasn't the climax, a pause. This was just discovery. Asterisk, the courtroom was packed again, but this time it wasn't the press feeding the frenzy, it was the people. From the mothers in head wraps to the law students with tablets, from retired judges in the back row to teens live streaming from the pews, all eyes were on Jasmine Crockett. She stood at the lectern like a conductor about to summon a storm. Your Honor, she said clearly, her voice steady, I am filing a motion today under Rule 26 for full discovery, not just on the subject of this hearing, but on the external affiliations, financial entanglements, and coordinated disinformation efforts that have directly affected the proceedings and public trust. Bondi's team didn't see it coming. A murmur rose like wind across dry grass. Judge Klein blinked. Counselor, are you implying there's coordinated misconduct relevant to these proceedings? Jasmine nodded. I'm not implying, Your Honor, I'm stating. She tapped her tablet. A projection flickered to life behind her documents, emails, and donor records. Some redacted, many not. They showed a trail, from Bondi's nonprofit all the way to federal lobbying groups, private correctional contractors, and a shadowy legal foundation that had been quietly rewriting legislation state by state. Bondi's attorney jumped up. Objection. This is outside the scope. Overruled, Judge Klein said, voice firm. Let her continue. Gasps rippled. Jasmine continued, walking through each connection like a surgeon exposing diseased tissue. Mr. Bondi has stood in this room and called me divisive, radical, dangerous, but I've stood on no foreign payroll. I've sold no law to the highest bidder. I've manipulated no facts. She turned toward Bondi, who was stone-faced. I've just revealed them. Bondi leaned toward his attorney, whispering, his composure breaking for the first time. His face twitched. Jasmine paused. In a democracy, she said, turning back to the judge, we don't just have a right to the truth. We have a legal obligation to uncover it, no matter how powerful the people it implicates. Outside the courtroom, the motion spread across newsrooms like oil on fire. Cable shows split-screen Jasmine's filing with investigative reporters. Commentary. Legal scholars debated the scope of her claim. But in living rooms and cafes, people weren't analyzing, they were feeling. A public hunger had awakened. Because this wasn't just about one man anymore. This was about systems. And Jasmine had just cracked one open like a gavel splitting wood.